Hello, welcome to everyone who's joining us. Thank you for joining us. Our webinar today is called Debunking the Myths of Underage Drinking. April is Alcohol Responsibility Month, so we're looking forward to our discussion today, and we'll end with looking towards the future of alcohol responsibility. My name is Erin Hildreth, and I'm a part of the Responsibility.org team. Before I start, I just want to let you know that we'll be recording the session today. You guys heard the little notice there. It will be available on the Responsibility.org YouTube page later today or early tomorrow. And we'll also send out the links to both of our webinar sessions after the conclusion of the second session, which takes place on April 26th. We'll also make sure that it's on our website. Everyone is on mute at this time, and if you have a question, which we absolutely encourage, please enter it into the Q&A box, which is right next to the chat box, and that will allow us to address the questions a little bit more easily. Okay. So the mission of Responsibility.org is threefold. We work to eliminate underage drinking, which is why we're all here today. We work to eliminate drunk driving and work with others to eliminate all forms of impaired driving. We also work to empower adults of legal drinking age who choose to drink to do so responsibly. Over the past 30 years, we've made great progress on all three of these missions, but we have not done it alone. We all have a seat at the table of responsibility, and responsibility starts with each one of us. Responsibility.org is all about conversations that lead to a lifetime of healthy alcohol choices, but not every conversation is about alcohol, especially over the last 2 years as we've navigated the ever-changing landscape of the pandemic. As adults, we have a social responsibility to be good citizens, good humans, and to raise the next generation to be the same. We are very excited to have these webinars available for you. And so we're ready to let's go. We have a great panel of expert speakers here with us today. And so I'll ask you all to introduce yourselves. Let's start with Phyllis.
Hi, I'm Phyllis Fagel, and I'm a school counselor in Washington, D.C. and a therapist. And I'm really excited to join everyone here today.
Thanks, Phyllis. Kim?
Hi, everyone. I am Dr. Kim Van Dusen, otherwise known as the parentologist, usually on most social and blog platforms. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I'm a registered play therapist and university professor. And I'm also a podcaster now. I have my own podcast called the Parentologist Podcast, and I'm happy to be here today.
Excellent. Thank you. And Rick.
Batting cleanup, Rick Burt. I am the president and CEO of SAD, Students Against Destructive Decisions. We work with middle schools, high schools, and colleges across the country using a peer-to-peer model of prevention, education, and activism on a variety of health and safety topics. So very excited for our conversation and to join this esteemed panel.
Perfect. Thank you guys for being here. And I'm really excited about this conversation. So let's start with the state of underage drinking as a whole. Despite what many people might think, underage drinking rates are going down. So I'm going to share with you some stats that help support that. So in fact, 78% of 8th graders in the US have never consumed alcohol. And the number who are not drinking has increased 48 percentage points since 1991. So that's over the last 30 years. And past 30-day alcohol consumption, so that would be in the past month, among high school seniors fell to its lowest levels in 2021. 1 in 4 12th graders are current drinkers, but that is down 38% from 2012. So although I can't say we call this good news because that would be zero, the news keeps getting better. And so how do you think we got here? Rick, I'll start with you.
Yeah, thanks, Erin. I do think it is better news. And I think we've gotten here because of the old adage that it takes a village to raise a child. I've been really impressed with how a variety of stakeholders have really embraced this conversation and embraced the idea of responsibility at a multitude of levels. Certainly, I think parents are more in tune with this conversation, still with a long way to go and a lot of talking points that need to be addressed. And we'll get into that later today. I think we've done a better job of integrating our mental health and addiction services into our communities to be able to identify warning signs, to be able to respond. And from my perspective, we've also done a really good job of involving young people. They are a key part of this conversation. And so peer-to-peer education, getting young people involved and giving them a sense of empowerment to speak up and discourage this, and by highlighting other alternatives and the risk factors and warnings. All of those are key objectives to how I think we're seeing this progress, as you said, with still a long way to go.
Perfect. Thank you. And Phyllis?
I think that one of the things that has been working really well is the fact that parents have been having just more open and authentic conversations with their kids about things like family history, maybe a genetic predisposition, talking to them about the types of scenarios that they might find tempting, or that they might find themselves in a situation where they're likely to be more impulsive, and treating them with the respect and with the understanding that they're capable of making those kinds of critical choices for themselves, but arming them with that information rather than avoiding the subject altogether.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. So we're actually going to move to our next myth, and that is that kids get alcohol from unknown sources. I don't know where they get it, when in fact, family and friends continue to be a leading source of alcohol for today's youth. In fact, 60% of current underage drinkers report that family and friends are their source for the alcohol that they've consumed. So what are some ways that families or households can prevent kids and teens from accessing this alcohol? Kim, can you start?
Sure. I think it starts with being on the same page with your children. I think it starts with open communication and being consistent. One thing I think that's really helped is letting your kids know it's okay to say no. Letting them know that if their friend says, or if they're at a friend's house and something is presented to them, that it's okay to say no, and to be okay with that and accept that. Also, I think that, looking at your family values is also a big part of it. I know in our home, we don't have a liquor cabinet. We don't have any alcohol locked away. That's just our prerogative. I know every household's different, and there's no judgment on how, anyone does in their household, but in our household, we only consume the alcohol that we're going to drink at that given time. So if we're hosting a party, we have enough alcohol for that time. And then whatever we don't drink during that party, we get rid of somehow. Or if my husband and I are gonna have a glass of wine after dinner one night together, on like a little date night at home, since we have two little ones and it's hard to get out sometimes, we'll make sure that our values in our home is to only have the alcohol in the house that we're actually going to consume at that time. And then otherwise it's not just around for them to get curious about or to explore and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's really interesting. And I'm sure that as kids grow and become more mature, those conversations will also change. The values will stay the same. So I think that's great. Phyllis?
I think it's really important that parents understand that they are responsible for what happens in their house, and that if they have alcohol on hand, that maybe they want to have a different kind of setup for the kids, that they make it very clear that only people of legal age can drink, and that they're consistent across the board with that message, whether they're talking to their kids or their kids' friends. And so that's the expectation for any kids coming into that house in the first place.
I think absolutely. And one thing that Dr. Kim, that you said, I mean, telling kids that they can say no, I think it's also important that parents understand that they can say no too. If their child says it's a party or something, the answer is just no. And not that our kids would ever try to manipulate us, oh no, but it's good for us to know that we can say no too. All right, so we're going to move on to the next one, and that is that kids ignore their parents. I know that I'm a parent, and it's hard to believe that this is a myth, but in trend data reaching back to 1991, youth between the ages of 13 and 17 report that their parents have the strongest influence on their decisions to drink or not to drink alcohol. And that influence has increased from 55% in 1991, when many of us were around that age, to 65% in 2021. So why do you think that parents underestimate their influence on their kids' behaviors? I'll actually start with you, Rick.
Yeah, I think so. Oftentimes we just assume that that the words are going in one ear and out the other, right? But I think we also assume that there are other sources that our young people are being impacted by, whether that be friends or the culture at school or even the culture in the media. Certainly, we know that young people's consumption of digital media, of movies and other forms of influence have increased in recent years. I mean, my gosh, after the past 2 years, we are all somewhat glued at the hip to our technology, right? And so I think there's this assumption that students and teens are absorbing their morals and their vantage points of alcohol from these other sources. But just as you said, Aaron, parents continue to be a leading influencer. And I think we have to realize that influence starts at even a young age. When we think about, have these conversations, I would dare say it's almost never too young to start having this conversation around the behaviors that you're seeing mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, caring adult having, and understanding too that it's the whole family dynamic, not just the parents, but other caring adults that folks have coming into their homes and into their lives too.
Exactly. Yes. And Kim, how about you?
I just want to piggyback off of what Rick just said. I have an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old at home, and I am sometimes very surprised at how much they actually pick up and how much of a sponge they actually are. And although, I've been working, with Responsibilityorg for many years now, and so I have been very open about educating them, having communications with them about alcohol use and, if we have alcohol use and whatnot. And it's just amazing that even at that 5-year-old or 8-year-old age, I hear a lot of parents say, oh, well, I'll have those conversations with my kids when they're older. Yeah. And I come back and say, no, it starts early. We need to be preventative. Let's be proactive instead of reactive, is kind of my prerogative with that. Mm-hmm. But as an educator and as a parent, I think the education starts at home. The communication starts at home, and parents are a child's first teacher. And, we're role models for them. And so those conversations do start early. It can be preventative at a very young age because they're watching anyway. They're watching what we're doing. They're watching what we're drinking. They're watching what we're saying. And when I see my kids regurgitate something that I've said to them, to a friend or to their teacher or somebody else, and think, oh, wow, they really were listening. And that's phenomenal, because sometimes as parents, we think they're not listening, but they are. And so the more consistent we are, the more conversations we're having, the more that we follow through with those things, they really are picking up on it, and they really are influenced by that.
Yeah. I really love that you said not just the conversations, but the modeling too. I think that's really important. We do have a comment, so I'll ask one of you to take it, but Brian said, I do not have kids. However, I see parents today partying with their kids and trying to be more like a friend than a parent. What could be something to say toward that?
I'll take that. I think that one of the things that's really hard right now for parents is that they've seen their kids be what feels like deprived of a lot of developmental milestones, a lot of fun experiences. They see that their kids are more sensitive, more vulnerable, more insecure about where they are in that friend group that they're a part of. And they are more vulnerable to making poor decisions when they're in that situation. But I think parents need to recognize that they also are more vulnerable to maybe making decisions they wouldn't have made before the pandemic in a bid to what feels like helping their child. And just taking a step back and reminding yourself that the greater gift you can give your child is to give them those critical thinking skills, to give them those refusal skills, those anticipatory problem solving skills, and to help them and arm them with information and with all of the tools they need to say no, rather than try to, quote unquote, boost their popularity by having them engage in the exact behavior that won't set them up for that kind of long-term success.
And Aaron, I would add to that, I've talked with parents coast to coast who have said, well, I feel better if they're drinking in my presence. I feel better if I can control the dynamic and if I can show them, how to safely consume alcohol. While I appreciate that, we know that what the science says. The science says the later you can delay that onset of that first consumption, the more likely you are to have that healthy relationship with the substance. And so I encourage parents to really rethink that and to frame their conversation, just as Brian said, not about being a friendship, but one is almost like a mentorship, where you can have conversations about the biology, the science, and particularly I think Gen Z, which we're working with now, really appreciates that frank, honest conversation where it's not just a do as I say, not as I do, but a real kind of dig into the meat and potatoes, if you will, of why we do have an age 21 drinking law and why there are things that are in this space. So I think that frankness and that openness, just as we've talked about already, is key even in this aspect.
Great. Yep. I feel like we're getting a lot of love in the comments for these comments. So thank you for that. So we'll definitely touch on that more too as we continue on. So we've addressed some of the myths, and I love that we've even started to get into the discussion of the whys and the why are these myths. But I want to chat more. And so at responsibility.org, and I mean, really everywhere, we often talk about the importance of these conversations. And as Dr. Kim just pointed out, of modeling responsible behaviors as well. And some parents just aren't comfortable with having a conversation about alcohol. And so we're here to encourage them to have those conversations. So what are some of the best ways to start conversations with kids or with teens? Phyllis, can we start with you?
Sure. And going back to what Rick said, we are mentors as parents. We're coaches, really. And something that I often tell middle school parents in particular, that's where I tend to focus most of my writing, is that even if it looks like they don't care what you say or what you think, they very much care. And they have specific needs, and not all kids are going to have the same needs. But one of the easiest ways to back into a conversation is to give them facts, to give them information, to let them know how alcohol can impact not only their brain development, but the kinds of risky situations they might find themselves in, the kind of harm that could happen when they're in a situation where they cannot think as rationally or as reasonably as they would if they hadn't been drinking. And then to really talk to them about, with questions, with curiosity, what do you think might put you in a situation where you would be more likely to make a poor decision? We know that it's not peer pressure per se, but rather peer presence. You are who you're with. And if you are surrounding yourself with other kids who drink, you're going to be much more likely to drink. Having those kinds of conversations, making it a little less personal, talking about things that you've seen in the news, even a fact like you shared, Erin, about how parents have a big influence, or how kids are actually drinking less now than they used to, can really initiate a conversation that doesn't feel threatening or doesn't feel like they might get in trouble if they share whatever they're seeing in their own school setting or among their own peer group.
Right. I love the fact that there is seriously such a great conversation going on in the chat right now. Jackie commented that these conversations are not a one-time thing, which I'm sure we'll jump right on top of that in agreement. Very similar to what you said, Phyllis, peer-to-peer connections are very, very important. And then, of course, as parents, we're not their friends, but I love that Rick said we're their mentors, because there's a fine line. And of course, each family's dynamic and their relationships are different. But again, with those starting the conversations, Kim, I know that your kids are younger. What would you say toward that?
Yeah, I just also want to mention that I feel like parents tend to underestimate themselves, even including myself. Like I said, they're sponges and they're always picking up things, even if we don't think they are. My daughter has a tendency to kind of look to the side like this, thinking like, if I'm not looking at her, she won't be looking at me, or she won't be listening, even though her ear is much closer to me than her eyes. So, I think like I said, it starts early, it starts preventatively. And even if it's not alcohol you're talking about at the young age, I think just being able to have a close parent-child attachment, having an open conversation with them about even just things about what's going on in their day, just to keep a pulse on what's happening in their everyday lives. So even as early as Rick was saying, it starts early. And even as early as toddlerhood, you can do daily check-ins with your children and say, how was your day today? Who are you playing with at school? And it doesn't have to be a long lecture. It can be a very quick check-in around the dinner table. It could be driving home from school to home, a 5-6 minute drive where you're not even making eye contact. It's just they're in the back seat. You say, how was your day? And a toddler even can give you a thumbs up, a side thumb or a thumbs down. So it happens so early, and that's the way you can do a daily check-in. With older kids, elementary school and whatnot, you can do scaling on 1 to 10. How was your day? You know, one being having those daily quick check-ins just to keep a pulse on who their friends are, what's going on at school, you know, how they're doing, what their plans are, things like that. We talked about being friends, you know, finding common ground with them, finding something that you can relate to with them on any topic, just to let them know that you're their ally, if you will. Again, we're not their friend, we're their mentor, but we're also their ally. We're there to support them. And the more that we show support in all realms of their life, whether it's a sporting event, a musical instrument they're playing, whatever it is, you know, making sure that they know that we're there support them, you know, no matter what. I could go on and on. I wrote a blog about it recently. If anyone wants to check it out, I can share the link in the chat. But I have a whole bunch of tips on my blog, but those are just a few that come to mind.
Yeah, please do. I know that one thing that our good friend Brian Coleman, who is a school counselor, also says the rose and the thorn. So what's the rose of your day and what's the thorn of your day? And it kind of helps to balance out some of the challenges with some of the successes. We do have a question from Mariana asking some detail on some actual tips to give our kids on how to say no to their peers. So not just that they should say no, but what are some tips? Phyllis, can I start with you?
Yeah, sure. You know, first of all, they can always blame an outside external factor. You know, I have to get up early tomorrow morning, or I'm competing in a track meet, or my parents would kill me, whatever it is that they can use to just have that plausible reason. But I do want to remind parents to share with your kids that from my experience working with tweens and teens, they actually won't get much pushback from their peers. It's not like when they say no, everyone's going to say, come on, just do it anyway. The kids, their peers, especially if they're good friends, tend to just accept that response. So just having some set phrase in and of itself can alleviate that anxiety they might feel about what they would do. But I think they'll find that if they have any excuse whatsoever, that will be that, and the topic will be dropped.
That's great. I definitely saw someone in the comments. They're coming in faster than I can read them, which I appreciate, but there are a lot of online resources. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Responsibility.org has a whole program called Ask, Listen, Learn, which is underage drinking prevention. There are conversation starters and there are all kinds of videos there, but there, and definitely a lot of state organizations have resources as well. Okay, so we're going to keep on moving. I love this. I feel like we could talk all day about it. Next, we're going to talk about the pandemic. So the pandemic found us all indoors more. And what impact do you think that had on underage drinking? Rick?
So I think there are several, and again, that could be a whole webinar in and of itself, and I think it will be the body of much research as we move forward. But, you know, some things that I've heard from young people is that it certainly changed the family dynamic. I think, you know, most families were running 14 different directions between band practice and faith communities and little league games and choir concerts. And all of a sudden, every family member was home 24/7, for good and for worse, right? I think that, you know, changed the fact that most underage drinking happens as a social affect. So young people are more likely to consume when they're in a social setting. Well, when you're home with mom and dad, I think that changed the dynamic of how and when underage drinking took place. But the other thing I think that's important to underscore, and I mentioned this earlier, is the impact on our mental health, not just when we're talking about young people, but everyone's mental health. The CDC released a report a few weeks ago sharing that 1 in 4 young people of high school age are currently struggling with some sort of diagnosable mental health condition. So when you think about anxiety, depression, all of the impacts that has, and the outlet that most teenagers are looking for to get that sense of release, alcohol is continuing to be that drug of choice. So I think there's certainly a deeper connection that we need to understand between the mental health aspect of young people and the ongoing mental health crisis that we will have, even as hopefully COVID-19 kind of fades into the sunset.
Absolutely. And so you guys know I always work with a script, and I feel like Rick just read right off of it. So when it comes to the pandemic, we do know everyone was affected. There is still uncertainty, struggle, division, unending change, and of course that lack of consistency that we find so important and grounding And of course, there was stress. Families were very, very affected. Well, responsibility.org, we did some research, and then I'm going to share with you some of the findings, and then of course we'll chat about that. First of all, and this is probably not a surprise, that half of all parents are reporting that their children have had more exposure to adults drinking within the home during the pandemic. It's 23% of adults who said that they drank more during lockdowns than they did before. We also do find that, not all news is bad news, that 18% of adults lowered their drinking or stopped drinking altogether. 1 in 6 adults said that they drank in front of their children more than they did before the pandemic. And then 10% said that their children, of course, had more exposure to alcohol because of happy hours that they were having. I mean, the Zoom happy hours, once we were comfortable gathering in small groups, having people over and saying, of course you can bring your kids, that exposes kids to alcohol. So we'll talk about that a little bit. And if kids were, and they were, exposed to more alcohol within the home, how can families turn this into a teachable moment? Phyllis?
I think we have to remember that kids, and I often say they have a PhD in their parents. So they're studying their parents, they're noticing everything. You can try to sweep under the rug if you're drinking a lot more than you did before, but they are noticing. And so being authentic and acknowledging what they're seeing and using that as in a way to initiate a conversation about what responsible drinking looks like. If you are drinking responsibly, then they are internalizing that that is the way to consume alcohol. If you're not, then they're internalizing a different message, and you need to actually acknowledge that and have a conversation about it. I think it's also really important, and this goes back to that idea of mentoring or coaching, that we as parents, and I have 3 teenagers myself, that we are coping out loud, that if we are prone, let's say, to having a glass of wine when we're stressed, to maybe even say that, I would like to have a drink because I'm really stressed, but you know what I'm going to do instead? I'm going to call a friend, or I'm going to go for a run, and just modeling for them that, yes, the reality is that we're not always inclined to do what's best for us when we're not in the best mental headspace, but we have to keep working at it. We have to prioritize our well-being in ways that actually will make us feel better and not worse.
Absolutely. Yes. Kim, can you pick up from there?
Yeah, absolutely. As Phyllis was saying, all those impressions are being made on our kids, as we've gone through the pandemic and even now. And so some reevaluation, I think, needs to be done. What happened in the last 2 years, it's happened. And now depending on how you reacted to stress in the home, then there's a way that you can change it now and soon. So I actually just shared it's National Stress Awareness Month, as well as Alcohol Responsibility Month. And so I actually just shared a reel on my Instagram last week of 10 ways to cope with stress without drinking alcohol. And as a mental health therapist, I really do believe that it's something that we really do need a role model for our children on how to deal with our stress, because stress is going to be around every day. And if it's good stress, like let's say you start a new job or you just had a new baby or whatever it is, stress is going to be there no matter what, and sometimes there's good stress and kind of some bad stress, but how we deal with that stress. And so like Phyllis was saying, using our positive coping skills instead of our maladaptive ones, going on a run, doing some meditation, taking some deep breaths, and inviting your children to go with you, saying, I had a really bad day at work today, or I just got some really bad news. I'm super stressed out. Can you just take a walk in the neighborhood with me? Or can you just do a couple deep breaths with me? Teach them how you cope with stress and invite them to do it with you so they know. I'll never forget this. I was, as a play therapist, I work with children, instead of doing talk therapy, it's through play therapy. And there was a child, we had a little kitchen, like a baby kitchen. And you never know sometimes how something affects a child until you see it in play. And the child went to the little kitchen and it was like a root beer type thing, but it looked like it could have been a beer bottle or something. The child got the little root beer and started like kind of chugging it, kind of looking at it. And I said, oh, what are you doing? Are you thirsty? And the child, my client, said, no, I just had a really bad day at work, so I'm going to have a drink. And this was a small child that was saying this. So this is what the child was picking up in their home, and they're reenacting it and processing it through this play, like mimicking what their parent was probably doing in the home. So I think the parent didn't see that, I did, and I was able to process that and work it out with the child. But like I said, I do think it starts in the home, and it starts now. So if you haven't dealt with it well in the past, that is okay. Give yourself some grace, forgive yourself for saying, I didn't do the best job with this, but we can move forward, and we can move forward in a positive direction now. And again, just reiterating what I just said, but looking at what different ways to deal with your stress without using alcohol, and then showing that to your kids and inviting them to do it as well, so they learn that lesson too.
Absolutely. What Myra said in the comments was they are watching, so be sure that you're modeling that type of behavior you want them to follow. Could not agree with her more. There is one question that it's on topic, but it's not part of this conversation exactly, but I would love to ask one of you to address it. And it's from Deborah. She said, if your child has already consumed alcohol, how do you handle that? What should the consequences be? And how do you limit their exposure while allowing them to be social?
I'm happy to jump in. I think that when we are talking about young adolescents, older adolescents, they're all still learning. And I think we always have to give them a runway back to being a good kid, a good kid in quotes, because they are going to make mistakes. And, it's like the expression, where does good judgment come from experience? Where does experience come from bad judgment? So if we shame them and we make it absolutely impossible for them to get back in our good graces, and all we're doing is criticizing them for their behavior, they're not going to learn. They're going to be, firing from their amygdala in that state of stress. So first, we want to give them kind of a runway back by saying something like, I imagine you were drinking because your friends were drinking, or you wanted to fit in, or whatever it is that we want to give them as that plausible excuse, and then say, here's why it's not okay. And then that's where you can really share your values. When it comes to the consequences, I think they should be logical, and they should relate specifically to whatever the transgression is. So if they were out too late, then they breached your trust, and then maybe you give them less freedom. If they lied about what they did, I would have a consequence for that that's distinct from whatever that consequence is for the behavior, for the drinking, so that they understand that being honest is a value that is really important to you. So taking the time to actually explain why you're imposing the consequence. I'm a big fan too of saying, what do you think we should do? Often kids are harder on themselves than you would be on them in the first place, and giving them some ownership and some opportunity to discuss it with you. And the last thing I'll say, and this is something that comes up a lot, it's a question I get from parents all of the time, which is, my kids are so rude. They're like, why can't I do that? Or they have this tone. And I really encourage you to ignore the tone, ignore the direct question that might seem like it's just trying to get a rise out of you or push your buttons, and recognize that it's actually a sign of respect. They want to know what's going on in your mind when they're asking you, like, why can't I do it? They actually want to know, like, why can't I do it? If you can try to stay calm and answer that question, and stay in that calm place, that emotion contagion is real, you may find that you have a really fruitful conversation, and you might even discover that they didn't even want to drink. They drank because of XYZ pressures, and that's an opening then to talk to them about how they can avoid that happening to them again.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Wow. Wonderful. So we'll, before we move on to the next slide, one more question. How do all of these conversations go hand in hand with the mental health conversations, or the focus on social and emotional learning that have gotten more attention, probably the attention that they've always deserved? Kim, can I start with you?
Oh, I thought I was on mute. Sorry. I got distracted by something real quick. Erin, will you please repeat the question?
Of course. So all of these conversations, I mean, how do they go hand in hand with mental health conversations that you're having, or the social and emotional learning that's taking place within the schools? How do all these conversations about alcohol responsibility and responsible actions go hand in hand?
Yes, absolutely. And it does go along with mental health, because I feel like depending on how our mental health is may affect how much we drink. How we drink in front of our kids, how we may have conversations with our kids. Like Phyllis was saying, how calm we are in front of our kids, how we react to them. If our stress levels are high, then we may be quicker to react in a more negative response back to them if they're asking us something. I couldn't agree with more with what Phyllis was saying about the why. A lot of times, especially therapeutically, and even as a parent, when we tell our children why, or tell them the why of something, it really helps. So I think, as a mental health clinician, I know I like to say globally, mental health was severely affected over the last 2 years with the pandemic. And I did see there was a correlation between mental health and alcohol responsibility during that time. But I think it just goes right back to what we've been saying before about having conversations, having open conversations with their kids, letting them know it's okay to bring questions to us, to, like Phyllis was saying, not to shame them, to have that open door for communication, and to talk about not only how they're doing mentally, socially, whether it's at school with their peers, how they feel like they're doing in school, how they're doing in general, how just, keeping a pulse on them emotionally, mentally, physically, etc. And then when we are that close to our children, we have that attachment with them, then having conversations with something that's a little bit tougher of a topic like alcohol is going to be more received in a better way by our children, because we've already built that trust. They've already built, knowing that we're not going to, shame them. We're going to validate them for how they're feeling, and then help them find ways to cope with those emotions, and whatnot. So.
Yes, absolutely. And then in terms of family dynamics and family conversations, I mean, I know that some families became closer during the pandemic, and they kind of thought of it as, well, the silver lining. But of course, some families struggled. So what did you see in family dynamics during the pandemic, or some conversations, Phyllis?
I think it depends on the family. So for some families, yes, they grew closer. Maybe it was an opportunity to delve into topics that in the past, everybody was running around in so many different directions, they didn't get a chance to talk about. For other families, it was a time of such incredible stress and fear that maybe conversations that should have happened were neglected entirely. And so it will depend on the family. But for those who really got that window into their child's life in a way that they might not have had in the past, and this goes to what everyone has been saying about mental health, we know that kids' mental health took a hit, and we know that kids are more likely to make poor choices or to drink before the age of 15 if they have risk factors. And some of those risk factors relate to mental health. Some relate to social challenges. Some relate to maybe academic struggles that they experienced during virtual learning. Maybe they're still behind, or their self-esteem, their academic self-concept took a hit. So recognizing that if your child did struggle in one of these realms, they might need support, and that by giving them the support, directly addressing whatever is getting in their way, it will actually set the stage for them to have more success when it comes to making these good choices in other realms.
Excellent. Yeah, absolutely. And so I put together a quick slide that still speaks toward this. And really, it's, if they're seeing it, it's time to say it. I feel like if there is a theme to the last couple minutes of our conversation, this could be it. Your kids perhaps have been seeing it more, so it's time to talk about it. We've talked about some great ways to start these conversations. So these are just some that we put together, so that if anyone needs to screenshot this for a little bit later, they can absolutely do it. And then before we move on to our very next slide, Dr. Kim, I'll ask you, someone's asking if you could please post your blog onto the comments.
Yes, I will do that right now.
That. Thank you. And so because it's Alcohol Responsibility Month, and we are defining the future of alcohol responsibility, every single person who is part of this conversation today, obviously, this is part of their interest. And so I'll just ask you, how do you define the future of alcohol responsibility? And I'll ask you guys in turn. So Rick, we haven't heard from you in a minute.
Yeah, great. I get to go first. That's a good question, Erin. I would say that the future of alcohol responsibility is going to be defined by impact and influence. And what I mean by that is that I think when we want to make an impact on these numbers, despite the political discourse and the division in our country, everyone understands the need to talk about underage drinking to keep young people safe. So I think as a unifying voice, we need to talk about those key influencers, and whether that be teens talking to teens. I appreciated the comments in the chat about the value of young people really being a leading cheerleader in this conversation, to be there in that moment of decision when someone's about to take that first drink or about to be an impaired driver or whatever it might be, but to really speak up in that moment and be a power of influence. And I think that's how we're going to really redefine our culture and even take more ground as we move forward, talking about some of these factors are by realizing those influence points and those inflection points that young people face, and work for and towards a day when hopefully we're celebrating a day of zero.
Perfect. Yes. Phyllis?
I love that. That was a really great answer. I would add teaching, talking, and modeling is really at the core of all of this. Letting kids know what responsible drinking is, letting them know about their own bodies, letting them know that there is always the option to call us, the parents, no questions asked, if they're in an unsafe situation. And then modeling for them that we are also willing to learn, that we're discovering new information every day, that we want to share it with them, that we see them as the expert in their own lives and we trust them with that information, and that we are there. We can't fix everything. I think the pandemic has taught us nothing else. We can't shield them from all of these really hard experiences and disappointments that they've had over the last few years, but we're there to kind of catch them and to buffer them and to have that coaching role, which has been a theme throughout today, as opposed to focusing on, catching them being bad or really making sure we are imposing the exact right consequence. I think communication is much more impactful than that consequence can ever be.
Yes, I think that's really important to mention as well. And Dr. Kim?
I just want to, reiterate. I thought Rick and Phyllis really said it so well. I don't want to, repeat what they had said, because I thought what they had said was perfect. But I do want to reiterate what I said at the beginning of this webinar, and that is, please don't, underestimate your own power as a parent, and please start as early as possible, I guess is the best way to put it. Don't think your child is too early to have a discussion about it. Children will recognize different shapes of glasses, for instance, a wine glass versus a beer pint, or versus a water glass, or whatever, a coffee mug. Again, children observe it at such a young age. And I think sometimes we don't give credit to our children for that. And so I think just my advice, or I think the future of alcohol responsibility starts early. It starts preventatively. It starts in the home, and it starts with teaching moments, role modeling, and mentoring your children, and having those open conversations. And that starts with those really simple daily check-ins. Again, may not be about alcohol at the beginning, but it'll open the door for having those conversations, those harder conversations about things like alcohol as they grow older.
Absolutely, for sure. And I feel like everyone here is already, like, to sound a little cheesy, defining the future of alcohol responsibility by engaging in this conversation, so that they can turn around and engage in their own conversations at home, whether they have children in their home, whether they will in the future, or whether they're working around children. So I think that those are wonderful. And I do have one more question as we get along. And again, everyone, thank you for joining us here, and please continue to be chatty in the chat box and ask some questions in the question box. But responsibility.org, and we're celebrating our 30th year. We're closing out our 30th year, I should say. And our theme for Alcohol Responsibility Month is Responsibility Starts With Me. Again, I feel like because we're sitting here, we understand that we have that seat at the table of responsibility, but responsibility starts with you, because why? Phyllis?
Responsibility starts with me. And for me, in my role, both as a school counselor, as a parent, and even as a writer, I really feel like my role is to know what the students or children in my charge are, how they're doing, who they're with, how they're spending their free time, and what supports they need. To be almost like an anthropologist, dig down, find out what's going on, and then focus really on whatever that root cause is of any distress or insecurity they're experiencing, and focus more in that preventative piece than on everything that comes afterwards.
Yes. Rick, responsibility starts with me because
because I have the power to make the next best choice. So I think sometimes when we think about responsibility and some of these big, hairy, scary topics, whether you're a parent or a teen, it seems like a daunting conversation. It seems like, a formal sit down or a contract negotiation, but it's really talking about making that next choice. If you're in that situation where people are consuming alcohol and you feel unsafe, how do you get out of it? It's about making that next best choice as a parent to engage. As Dr. Kim said so well, in those little sidebar conversations and those little moments that can have a big impact. If you're a young person and you have the opportunity to discourage or to use your voice towards power, it really is about that next best choice. Not about what you've done in the past, not thinking about 5 years down the road. Think about that next best choice. That's how we change the culture, I think, of responsibility.
yes. And Rick, actually, Colleen is asking, can we use your quote? I am responsible for the next best choice.
Absolutely. Royalty contracts will be coming your way, Colleen. No, I'm kidding. Please, of course.
Yes, I like that. I do know that one of my mentors says risky behaviors run together. And I often tell my daughter who's 10 that if you're going to tell a lie, you're probably going to have to make up another lie to cover up for that lie. So I think that that's hit the nail on the head. And finally, Dr. Kim, responsibility starts with me because
I am part of my children's future. Today's the day to make the change, not tomorrow, it's now. If we wait till tomorrow, if we wait for someone else to try and make the change and think that someone else's responsibility, maybe it's their at school or their coach on their soccer team or whatever, it's not everyone. It is everyone's responsibility, but it's the soccer coaches, it's the principal at school, it's your child's teacher, and it's you. To think that it's someone else's job or that someone else is going to teach your child about that, it is, and it's also you. So it starts now, it starts today, not tomorrow, and the change begins with you, with me as well.
I love that. And I could think of no better note to end upon. So thank everyone here for attending this webinar. Thank you, Phyllis and Rick and Kim, for being wonderful panelists. Thank you to everyone for such great chatter in the chat box. I think that was so constructive and really added a nice note to our webinar together. Please make sure to visit responsibility.org for resources, especially the link to this webinar that will be up there later today. We mentioned this before, that if your kids are in that 9 to 13 age range and you're looking for underage drinking prevention materials, Ask, Listen, Learn has videos, conversation starters, and all kinds of things there. That's asklistenlearn.org. And then please plan to join us. We have a couple more Alcohol Responsibility Month events taking place next Tuesday. We'll be on Instagram Live at noon. And then on Tuesday, April 26th at 3 p.m., we have one more webinar that'll come at you. So please keep your eyes open for that. Again, thank you all so very much. I appreciate everyone for being here. Have a good day.